Westminster Shorter Catechism, questions 96 and 97. 96. What is the Lord's Supper? The Lord's Supper is a sacrament, wherein by giving and receiving bread and wine, according to Christ's appointment, his death is showed forth, and the worthy receivers are, not after a corporal or carnal manner, but by faith, made partakers of his body and blood, with all his benefits, to their spiritual nourishment and growth in grace. Question 97. What is required for the worthy receiving of the Lord's Supper? It is required of them that would worthily partake of the Lord's Supper, that they examine themselves of their knowledge to discern the Lord's body, of their faith to feed upon him, of their repentance, love, and new obedience, lest, coming unworthily, they eat and drink judgment to themselves. In our previous lesson, we covered the subject of baptism. How is it that baptism is made to be an effectual means of grace unto the salvation of God's elect? We talked about how the efficacy of baptism is not found either in the one who administers it or in the element of water itself, but rather the power belongs to God. God, by his sovereign grace, makes baptism effectual unto the salvation of his elect in the timing in which he has ordained, and by the power and grace of the Spirit who works faith in the hearts of the elect. And now, as we come to the Lord's Supper, we must say something very similar with regard to the power of the efficacy of the Lord's Supper as a means of grace. Now, first of all, it would help us to set forth before us then what the elements of the Lord's Supper are. Unlike baptism, which only has one element, namely water, the Lord's Supper has two, bread and wine. Now, we might ask ourselves before we get into the question of the power and the efficacy of the Lord's Supper, whether or not these two elements are the only elements that can be used. Can other elements be used? Well, the answer, in short, is yes, because the efficacy does not depend upon the elements. Nevertheless, ordinarily, we ought to use bread and wine. Why is that? Because bread and wine is the ordinance of the Lord Jesus Christ himself. The Lord, in his eternal wisdom, deemed that bread and wine would be the most effective way to communicate that which is signified in the signs themselves. The Lord Jesus ordained bread and wine to be the elements of the Lord's Supper. Now, are there circumstances under which bread and wine could not be used and something else would have to be substituted for them? And we might imagine scenarios and cases where that most certainly could occur. The question then is not whether or not other elements could be used, but what are the ordinary elements that ought to be used? And of course, bread and wine is what ought to be used. But in order to underscore this point, that the efficacy of the Lord's Supper is not resident within the elements themselves, we must conclude that other elements may also be used within the Lord's Supper. Once again, not because that is desirable, it's not. We ought to do the ordinary, the thing which Jesus himself has prescribed. But under extraordinary circumstances, certainly those other kinds of elements may be used because the efficacy is not within the elements themselves. So where then is the efficacy? The efficacy, of course, is found in God. God is the one who has the power, the sovereign power, to determine the efficacy of the sacrament. He is the one who brings about its effects in the hearts and in the lives of his people. It is not resident in the person who is administering the sacrament, in our case, the minister, nor is it in the elements themselves, but it is found in the sovereign power of God, who is gracious to administer his blessing to all those who receive worthily the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. So what then is signified in the Lord's Supper? Well, in short, what is signified in the Lord's Supper is the Lord's death. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26 says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." The Lord's Supper is there intended to communicate to us something of the death of the Lord Jesus. And notice here, as somewhat of an aside, that the Lord's Supper is to be celebrated until he comes. In other words, it is a perpetual ordinance within the church for the time between Christ's first coming and his second coming. It is a sacrament, an ordinance, which is not to be terminated or to not be practiced or to be mitigated in its practice for the entire time between Christ's first coming and his second coming. It is a perpetual ordinance to be observed until he comes again. But secondly, the Lord's Supper represents the death of Christ upon the cross. That as the Lord Jesus broke the bread, and as we, in the observance of the Lord's Supper, break the bread, we show forth in signs and seals the breaking of the body of Jesus when his body was broken on the cross. And when we pour out the wine into the cup, as Jesus poured out the wine, so likewise we see here as well a representation of the pouring out of the blood of Jesus upon the cross. And so the Lord's Supper shows forth, it signifies the covenant of grace as that covenant has been ratified by the death of Jesus. And so what is it that happens in the Lord's Supper? Well, in the Lord's Supper, as the Lord makes the sacrament effectual for the building up and edification of the saints, what happens in the supper is we are made to commune with the body and blood of Christ. In the Lord's Supper, we have fellowship with the Lord Jesus Christ in his resurrected and glorified body. As it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not participation in the body of Christ? Now, that word participation can be translated and understood in terms of communion or fellowship. There is a fellowship, there is a communion that we have with Christ's body and blood as we participate in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Now, we ought not to think that this idea of participation has in view any type of confusion, of intermixing of the body and blood of Jesus with our own body and blood. Because the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, as we participate in it, is not a participation which is carnal. In other words, what happens at the Lord's Supper is that we are not receiving, as it were, the transformed bread into the body of Jesus, literally understood. But what we are receiving in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper is just bread and wine. The elements remain what they are, bread and wine. They do not change into something other than what they are. But by virtue of the bread and wine, through the blessing of the Holy Spirit who works faith in our hearts, we have and are made to be lifted up from the table that is here on earth to the table of the Lord to have fellowship with him. We have fellowship with the Lord Jesus Christ at his heavenly banquet feast at the time of the administration of the Lord's Supper, not because there is any type of admixture of our body and blood with the blood and body of Christ, but only because and by virtue of the grace of the Holy Spirit, who sovereignly works in our hearts faith in order to make us to commune with the resurrected and ascended Lord Jesus in the heavenly places. And so, as that happens to us, as we have real communion and fellowship with Christ, we understand that Christ really is present at the Lord's Supper. And his presence, as real as it is not one after, of course, a localized carnal manner. And this is where our understanding of the Lord's Supper differs from that of Rome and even Lutheranism, where they would believe that the Lord Jesus is made to be locally present on the communion table or on the altar, as they would call it, by virtue of the words of institution uttered by the minister or priest. And then there, the Lord Jesus is present in, by, or with the elements, whether in a form of transubstantiation, Rome, or consubstantiation in the case of Lutheranism. But quite on the contrary, we understand that the presence of the Lord is not a carnal presence, but it is a spiritual presence. We might even say, better yet, a heavenly presence, whereby Jesus is not dragged down from heaven to the table, but rather, by virtue of the blessing of the Spirit, the people of God are lifted up from the earthly table into the heavenly places, where they are made to be present with Christ at the heavenly banquet feast of the Lamb. And so Christ really is present at the Lord's Supper, but he is present in a way that is heavenly and spiritual, accessed by faith, not by virtue of the transformation of the elements. And so this means that the nourishment that the Lord's Supper brings about is a spiritual nourishment. It is a spiritual nourishment as we have fellowship and communion with Christ, so we are built up in our faith. We are built up by Christ. Now, that spiritual nourishment is, of course, a blessing that is given to God's people according to the sovereign grace of God himself. But also, the Lord's Supper can become a means of judgment for those who participate in an unworthy manner. What does it mean to come to the table of the Lord in a worthy manner? Consider with me 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. So as we come to the table of the Lord, we come in a worthy way when we examine ourselves. When we examine our faith, to be assured of the fact that we are in fact in the faith. And if we are in the faith, if we are in Christ, then we come to the table of the Lord. We don't examine ourselves for merit. We don't go digging deep within looking to find out whether or not there is a meritorious basis upon which we can judge ourselves worthy to come to the table. It is not as if there is a certain strength that is prerequisite of our faith in order to come to the table of the Lord. It's not as if we need to be strong enough or holy enough in order to warrant or merit coming to the table of the Lord. No, the table of the Lord is a sacrament for sinners, and sinners who are always in the process of sanctification, never yet perfected in this life. And so those who come to the table of the Lord worthily are those who are sinners, but sinners who have been saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so we would do well to be sure that we be in the faith if we are in fact in the faith, to examine our works to see if they are commensurate with our faith, to see if in fact there is a lively faith there, a faith which works itself out in love. However imperfectly those works might be on this side of glory. And understanding that our works this side of glory will be imperfect, nevertheless, understanding them to be sincere drawn from Spirit-wrought faith in our hearts, then we come to the table of the Lord. We come with thanksgiving. We come with joy, understanding that as we come to the table, we'll be blessed. But also, we are called to discern the body. Now, the discerning of the body that Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians here probably has a threefold reference. On the one hand, it is a reference to Christ's death. Do we understand? Do we discern the fact that Jesus broke his body on the cross for our sins? If that is the substance of our faith, then we have discerned the body in that respect and come to the table of the Lord. But also, with regard to the meaning of the sacrament, do we have the biblical understanding and meaning of the sacrament such that we're not depending upon the sacrament as if it has its own inherent power, but rather depending on the Lord of the sacrament, looking unto Jesus, realizing that the bread and the wine are but signs and seals of the covenant of grace and of his glorious death on the cross for our sins. But then also, are we discerning the church? The church of the Lord Jesus Christ is his body. Are we discerning the church for what it is as the church, the body of Christ, the people of God? The problem in Corinth was that there were people who were participating in the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner because they were not caring for the rest of the body of the Lord Jesus Christ. They were getting drunk when others were going hungry. They were eating ahead of other people. The congregation was divided between the haves and the have-nots. And because of the body being divided, there was a lack of discernment of the body of Christ, namely the church as well. And so we ask ourselves, do we come worthily in the sense of, do we come to the table of the Lord in an orderly fashion with love towards our brethren? Are we reconciled to our brethren? Or do we still have something there that is between us? Is our relationship at a rift with one another? If so, have we sought reconciliation? As Jesus says, if your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, go, be reconciled to him first. And if we are in good and regular standing with the church of the Lord Jesus Christ, and we are discerning the body, and we are respecting and loving the people of God who constitute that body, and therefore we come in a worthy way. Having now covered the sacraments as a means of grace, we now turn to our final section, which is prayer as a means of grace. What is the duty that God requires of us in prayer? And we'll talk about that in our next lesson.